Patricia Carpenter. Brooklyn Moose. Tina Fontaine. Gloria Moody. Monica Jack. Ashley Mashisnik. Verna Samard. Tabitha Kallick. Cheryl Johnson. These are just 9 names that I could have chosen from a list of thousands. These are just 9 of the Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or have been murdered as part of the genocide that is impacting our country. Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately impacted by all forms of violence. This problem, it's not specific. It impacts First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. This is a national crisis. The RCMP have only confirmed just under 2,000 Indigenous women and girls that have gone missing or have been murdered. Other research, though, points to the number being closer to 4,000. The RCMP only have reports on the Indigenous women who self-identify as Indigenous, but a lot of women don't identify with their culture. This goes back to the time of colonization, as the assimilation practices made people not want to claim their culture, for if they did, there were negative repercussions. Take, for instance, that from 1980 to 2012, Indigenous women made up 16% of all female homicides in Canada, while being only 4% of the female population. Because of this trauma that's ongoing, there is a national inquiry that came out. Now, women and girls are impacted, but so are men and boys, but they're not talked about. When you look at the statistics, men and boys are often impacted more and at a greater amount than women and girls. As Dr. Adam Jones, a UBC political scientist, said, Aboriginal men are murdered extremely often relative to all other groups, and nobody really cares. Approximately 2,500 Indigenous peoples were murdered from 1982 to 2011. Of that 2,500, 1,750 were male, 745 were female, and a further 105 Indigenous women were listed as missing for at least 30 days, when the reasons for them going missing was deemed unknown or there was foul play suspected. Now, Canada, we tell ourselves we're like a moral leader of the countries in the world, but we've done some pretty ugly things. We like to wear blinders so we don't see the negative things in our history, but wearing blinders, it doesn't help us. Being willfully blind to the negativity is a hindrance. Take, for instance, that during the time of Indian residential schools, the settlers made it their duty to colonize the Indigenous populations of Canada from coast to coast to coast to fit into the ways of a settler lifestyle. Now, the Indigenous children went to these schools and learned the ways of a settler life, and slowly, over time, they began to pick up settler ways and lost touch of their own identities. Eventually, over time, the Indigenous cultures faded away. Oftentimes, even those who are survivors are still struggling to find ways to get through the atrocities. They're living through this, and this can be described with the 7th generation principle. This principle is based on an ancient Iroquois philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. Residential schools are still pretty recent in the history of Canada, which means we're still in the first few generations of this intergenerational trauma. To put this in perspective, the last residential school closed in 1996. I was born in 1999. Intergenerational trauma is what the 7th generation principle is all about. This trauma is defined as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across lifespans and over generations. A harm done to one group will carry on to the shoulders of their descendants. The trauma from residential schools is still impacting people in Canada. As Margaret Fenton and Jordan Fenton say in their book Fatty Legs, today the healing continues as the survivors, their children, and their children's children struggle to shed the shame of oppression and work towards reclaiming pride in their identities. Now, this is all forms of structural violence, both residential schools and this ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Structural violence is a form of violence wherein a social structure or social institution may cause harm to individuals by not allowing them to meet their own basic needs. We need to deconstruct both residential schools and missing and murdered Indigenous peoples in hopes of making things better for the future. For me, I grew up in BC, in Fraser Lake. Fraser Lake's located along the Highway of Tears. Now, I know at home this means a lot to people, and I'm sure a lot of you know what it is as well, but for those of you who don't know, the Highway of Tears is a stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia. This part of the highway runs from Prince George to Prince Rupert, which covers 724 kilometers. Along this stretch of highway, many women, mainly Indigenous women, have gone missing or have been murdered. These women add to the statistics of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Now, like I said, I'm from BC. You might be thinking that Acadia is a bit of a stretch, and why didn't I stay closer to home to go to school? Well, trust me, I get asked that question all the time. There was something about Acadia that drew me in and made me really want to go there. Being a small, liberal arts institution, schools like ours in the Maple League can offer so much more to students. Not only was the size of the school nice for me, as I came from a small high school, but the ability to form relationships has been an amazing bonus. Not only have I formed relationships with other students, but also with professors and community members. I feel like I have a family in Wolfville, and I couldn't have formed relationships like that anywhere else. Even though it's been hard at times, going to Acadia is the best decision that I could have made. Now, in terms of the national crisis, the Maple League's in an interesting spot. We're able to work together to make changes to make things better. And when we work together, we're able to lean on each other and make these changes faster. We say we want reconciliation, and if we're serious, we need to do something about it. Indigenous issues are at the forefront of many of the issues, not only in Canada, but in our League of 4 universities. Now, when it comes to making changes, this is a call to action. This is my call to action. And these are things that I think our institutions need to do if we're serious about change, and they need to happen within the next 5 years. But this is only a start. We need to have flags flying on all of our 4 institutions to celebrate the unceded territories that our universities are located on. By October 4th, 2020, I would like to see a Maple League-wide event for the National Day of Vigils for Sisters in Spirit. We need to have an ideas-based course on reconciliation held across our institutions. We've done it before, we can do it again for this. We should have an annual Indigenizing the Academy conference with Indigenous speakers from coast to coast to coast. Everybody's voices matter, and they all have different things to say. We need to have Indigenous advisors, counselors, and elders and residents yesterday. We need them on campus so Indigenous students have somebody to talk to. Indigenous student centers are also important because Indigenous students need to know they have somewhere they can go that's a safe space. Bishops has just invested in a new one. Who's next? We need to have scholarships for Indigenous students if we want to encourage Indigenous students to be coming to our universities. This is another form of reconciliation. We need to hire Indigenous scholars if we want to teach about Indigenous issues. A Canada Research Chair on each one of our 4 campuses is a necessity. And when we teach about Indigenous issues, it needs to be diverse, not regional. We need to listen to voices from Indigenous peoples all over the country. And finally, we need to have a cultural competency course for all faculty, staff, and administration to take to decolonize themselves, but we also need a mandatory course for all students to take because we need to make changes. Now, decolonization is going to take time. It's not going to happen all at once. But if we're serious and we actually want to make changes, we need to follow through. These calls to action are what I think needs to be done. This is a starting place. Let's start here and let's see where we can go, together. If we're serious about change and we want to transform together, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. As Senator Murray Sinclair, the chair of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said, "Education is what got us here. Education is what will get us out." So what are we going to do? Natalia.